Memes run the world. I'm talking about the memes that are much bigger than the stuff we share on the internet. The ones we live by without even noticing. The memes that have been circulating in our societies for decades, centuries, or even millennia. Memes more viral and enduring than the Vine boom. By memes, I'm talking about ideas, stories, beliefs, and elements of culture. Memes are to societies what genes are to populations. Our bodies carry genes, and our cultures carry memes. While our genes spread through reproduction, the memes we carry are way easier to spread through communication with all the people in our lives and all the media we consume. Some genes and memes are lethal, meaning they critically endanger the well-being of their carrier. If you've ever felt like something's just off about how the world works, part of that feeling probably comes from questioning the lethal memes that our society continues to carry, like the myth of work or the myth of freedom. Things seem to be getting worse and worse, yet these memes endure. Very few stop to question where they came from or what purpose they serve, or rather, who they serve. You see, the system isn't really broken, it's working exactly as intended, for the benefit of authorities. The memes we're going to explore are used to obscure, distract, or justify that intent so the status quo can continue. They are myths that serve the system. But these myths are only half of the story. They didn't come out of nowhere. They are continuously shaped by material conditions. How we live, what we have, and who holds the power. These myths are able to take root and spread because they reinforce status quo and serve the interests of those in authority. We may not be able to get rid of such destructive memes overnight, but we can spread different memes on the grassroots level. Memes that motivate us to challenge, dismantle, and transform our material conditions. But first, what are some of the lethal memes we currently carry? Today we're going to rank some of the most common myths that work to limit our freedom and our future so that we can create new memes that motivate meaningful material change. Before we start, I need to explain the criteria. A whole video could be dedicated to any of these myths, and I've actually covered a few of them in past videos. But we do have all day, so I'll try to be brief in my explanations for each. The ideas for the myths themselves came from my life experience and conversations, as well as a few books I've read or skimmed for inspiration. Now, S tier usually means the best of the best, while D tier means the worst of the worst, but we'll be flipping this criteria on its head. S tier myths are those that I think are the most impactful, deceptive, and resistant to questioning, while D tier myths are less impactful, more commonly questioned, and easier to deconstruct. B is, of course, somewhere in the middle. So let's begin. First up, they say that sex sells, so let's start with the myth of sex. This is the idea that men and women have fundamental differences in behavior, desires, and abilities. People will claim that men evolved to be more aggressive, promiscuous, and competitive, while women evolved to be more nurturing, monogamous, and emotional. But while the male sex and the female sex do have biological differences, like hormonal fluctuations, average size, and reproductive anatomy, such differences are actually quite minor when compared to our biological overlap. Biologists have been slowly building a more nuanced view as they continue to investigate the many biological parameters that determine one's sex and the people who don't fit neatly into our traditional understanding of those categories. When it comes to gender, how societies interpret and structure roles, behaviors, and identities based on perceived sex, there's even more variation, both within and beyond man and woman. Contrary to pop history notions of early humanity, the evidence indicates that both men and women were involved in raising children, gathering food, hunting, and protecting the group. Both men and women can be aggressive, nurturing, empathetic, intelligent, and ambitious, with more variance in these traits within genders than between them. Not to mention, cultures across the world have acknowledged the genders that cross or exist outside of the binary. Our gender differences are heavily shaped, exaggerated, and enforced by cultural expectations and socialization. We are so much more than these boxes. If you want to read more about any of this, I recommend Race, Monogamy, and Other Lies They Told You by American anthropologist Agustín Fuentes. I want to put the myth of sex in A tier because it's still a widely enforced pseudoscience that reinforces inequality. It can be quite difficult for a lot of people to question due to its reliance on partial truths and misinformation, and it marginalizes the diversity of human experience that is shaped by both nature and nurture. Next up, the myth of scarcity. There's enough food, there's enough money, there's enough housing, there's enough energy, there's enough time. But that's wrong. While some resources are finite, the scarcity we experience is largely artificial. Because profit, not need, determines access. Everything we need to live comfortably is already abundant, but our access to that abundance wouldn't benefit the system, so it creates scarcity. It builds borders, shapes cities, encloses property, and monopolizes resources so that we can no longer easily meet our needs and must instead grind and compete for scraps. Thus, knowledge is paywalled by educational institutions, health is gatekept by medical institutions, and wealth is hoarded by those at the top. Artificial scarcity keeps prices high, and that's good for business. Even our very selves are not safe, as the ability to rest, to play, and to idle are made scarce by the system's impositions on our time. This system has what British author Darren dubbed a quenchless thirst to produce and consume, creating institutions which, in order to survive, must multiply needs and artificially impose deficiencies, regardless of the ecological and social consequences. We could break free from this myth once we recognize the abundance that would re-emerge when our resources are no longer hoarded by the few and our desires are no longer manufactured by consumerist priorities. Perhaps we can take a page out of the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Hunters and Gatherers, recognizing that 1. The economic notion of scarcity is a social construct, not an inherent property of human existence. 2. The separation of work from social life is not a necessary characteristic of economic production. 3. The linking of individual well-being to individual production is not a necessary characteristic of economic organization. 4. Selfishness and acquisitiveness are aspects of human nature, but not necessarily the dominant ones. And 5. Inequality based on class and gender is not a necessary characteristic of human society. I'll put the myth of scarcity in B tier. It's fairly impactful in our imagination, but I don't think it should be very difficult to uproot, as the evidence of abundance and its unequal distribution is pretty clear. The myth of universal human nature is one that I've covered on my channel twice. But in short, it's the assumption that there are these static, innate traits that humans possess which transcend environmental, social, and cultural conditions. People claim that humans are naturally greedy, naturally violent, or naturally hierarchical to justify capitalism, the state, patriarchy, and other social stratifications. As with the myth of sex, which is really an offshoot of the myth of universal human nature, this myth leans on misinformation, partial truths, and a decent dose of ignorance about the breadth of our species' possibilities. The reality is that while some instincts, inclinations, and needs are shared, the way we experience, express, and respond to these varies significantly across cultures and individuals. Human behaviors are shaped by our social relations and material conditions, and are thus varied. We are capable of love and hate, creation and destruction, cooperation and competition, equality and hierarchy. The manifestation of greed, violence, or altruism is heavily dependent on the systems in which people live. Egalitarian societies tend to facilitate cooperation, while hierarchical systems encourage exploitation. Neither are inevitable. To make claims about all human possibilities based on this time and place would be like concluding that it is in our nature to cough because you only observe humans living in smog. We can be so much more. The myth of universal human nature is so genuinely destructive and limiting to the psyche, and it's one that I encounter fairly often, so I'll put it in the S tier. And on to another myth that I've covered on this channel before, the myth of work, referring to the idea that work, or more specifically compulsory wage labor, is necessary, inevitable, and the primary way to contribute to society. But if you were setting up society, would you organize work this way? Would you structure our entire lives around it to the detriment of all else? This myth is not about labor in general. It's specifically about the kind of alienating work that we're forced to do to earn a wage and survive in this system. It's also about the culture that surrounds this kind of work, as people's worth and moral virtue become tied to their productivity, while rest, leisure, and other forms of labor are denigrated as lazy or unimportant. The system uses this kind of work to keep people distracted, dependent, and habituated to hierarchy, with little time or energy to question or resist. It's soul-crushing, and our health, environment, and connection to ourselves and our communities suffers as a result. Despite greater productivity and greater abundance, we're still told to work more and work harder. Politicians promise to create more jobs, and schools remain oriented around preparing their students to enter the world of work. But work is not the meaning of life. This kind of work will not set us free. We don't need more of it. We need it gone. We need a quantitative reduction of what American anthropologist David Graeber would call bullshit jobs. And we need a qualitative transformation of the labor necessary to live and enjoy life, self-directed and organized in common. Humanity deserves better than the grind. I put the myth of work in C tier. It is limiting and common, but also seems to be very frequently questioned. especially in my generation, and especially in the pandemic era. When you're burnt out, underpaid, and without a positive future in sight, work tends to radicalize people. Next up is the myth of meritocracy. I live in a fairly corrupt and openly nepotistic country, so it's not an idea that I often encounter, but I know there are people that have this idea both here, somehow, and in other parts of the world. The most extreme version of this idea is that equal opportunities exist for all, and success comes purely from individual merit. But there are those who recognize some inequality, but still attribute success and failure to individual merit. This myth ignores the obvious reality of our economic and social hierarchies. Under our economic system, the capitalist class has authority over the means of production and can therefore exploit the working class, which must sell its labor to survive. There are thus very few instances of class mobility between the two. There are also several additional hierarchies and inequalities that impact people's opportunities. What your gender is, what your race is, what abilities or disabilities you possess, what your sexuality is, what religion you follow, what country you're from, which part of the country you're from, what language you speak, what accent you use, what kind of household you come from, what education you have, what kind of work you do, how much capital you have, what political power you have, whether you pronounce it GIF or GIF, and so on and so forth. People can be privileged in one respect and disadvantaged in another. In the overwhelming majority of cases, it is the systems that people are born into and their powerless position within them that limit people's opportunities, not merit. If you've ever had to miss out on an unpaid internship because you couldn't afford it, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. Don't get me wrong, there are the occasional tokens of upward mobility that have some merit in the eyes of the system and are rewarded for their conformity, ambition, and ruthlessness. But most privileged people are born into that privilege and maintain it, no matter how mediocre they are, through economic capital, as in access to resources and property, social capital, as in well-connected friends and family, and cultural capital, as in accent, taste, manner, and so on. We are not all at the same starting line. This myth exists to obscure that fact, to convince the powerless that all they have to do is work hard and eventually they'll succeed, and to stir prejudices that keep them divided. I'm putting the myth of meritocracy in the B tier. It does its job well, legitimizing the inequalities baked into the system as fundamentally fair, and thus preserving the status quo. But I think with some basic agitation, the people on the receiving end of the system will be able to see through it. Next, we have the myth of schooling. This is another one that I've spoken about on my channel before. It's the idea that modern schools are the best ways to produce educated, creative, and successful members of society. But that's not really the system's priority. Think back to your school days. Were you learning to question the system, or just memorizing what you were told? The education system serves to socialize individuals into hierarchical systems, mainly capitalism and the state. There are those who believe that schools are great equalizers, but this is just an extension of the myth of meritocracy. Elite schools perpetuate privilege by grooming the ruling class, while public schools prepare students for subordinate roles in the economy. Public schooling conditions kids to obey authority and conform to their place in the system. Students become passive and uncritical receptacles of information in panoptic spaces where they're constantly monitored and disciplined. We deserve a much fuller learning experience. The myth of schooling is going in the B tier. Many of the problems with schooling are commonly recognized by those who've experienced it, but its impact is so insidious that they're not able to imagine much beyond minor reforms. Before we continue, I just want to give a quick thanks to those who support me on patreon.com/sayingtrue. I don't ever want to have to put sponsorships in any of my videos, and I'm able to do this work thanks to viewers like you. Thank you. Next, the trickle-down myth argues that the wealth created by the rich trickles down to everyone else through job creation and investment. So we should reduce regulation and give the rich tax breaks to benefit everybody. In the real world, the wealth that workers create flows upward and accumulates at the top. The elites invest the wealth they gain through the exploitation of labor and resources into offshore tax havens, speculative markets, and luxury goods that do nothing to stimulate local economies, while real wages stagnate or decline. The trickle-down myth is an easy detail. Maybe I'm in a bubble, but I think it's one of the most commonly ridiculed economic ideas of the 21st century, and I don't know anybody who purports to believe it outside of right-wing think tanks and neoliberal politicians. Next up, the myth of freedom upholds the belief that we all enjoy freedom in this system because we can all make choices in our markets, careers, political candidates, and lifestyles. But this freedom we have is conditional and superficial. The wealthy enjoy far greater access to resources and opportunities than the poor, while systemic barriers continue to limit people on the basis of race, gender, and other identities. You can choose between Adidas or Nike, but it all feeds into the same consumerism and props up the same overseas exploitation. You can choose your job, except when economic necessity forces you to put the fries in the bag. You can choose a political party, but the system doesn't fundamentally change with a different party color in power. Ultimately, we don't have much meaningful self-determination in this system. To paraphrase the 3 myths, we're only free to do what we're told and buy what we're sold. And if you don't want to join the free world, they'll force you. It's for your own good. But true freedom would require the ability to shape the conditions of your life, to be unbound by poverty, exploitation, and discrimination, and to have the freedom to associate with others to collectively pursue your shared futures. As Alan writes,
people who are free to choose invariably choose things which are good for themselves, their communities, and their environments, such as healthy local food, ample free time to take care of each other, active entertainment, sharing of tools, mastery of tools, and spending time with teachers they like.
The system, on the other hand, prefers choice to be limited to things which are good for the system, such as food transported from the other side of the world, no free time whatsoever, massively expensive, non-participatory spectacles, high-tech, imagination-limiting fun, everyone having their own drill, car, lawnmower, and printer, imposed motorways, imposed virtual communication, imposed syllabuses, and a mechanized world in which contact with human beings is increasingly impossible. These things equal growth, therefore you must choose them. If people didn't choose such things, the jet plane of the market would instantly run out of fuel and tumble from the sky, and that cannot be allowed to happen.
Meaningful independent choice then ceases to be visible, let alone practicable, and any suggestion that qualitatively different options might be available are unconsciously registered as an existential threat to be handled in the standard manner. Ignore, ridicule, attack, and exalt.
Took the words right out of my mouth. Real freedom lies far outside the system's imagination. I don't want to put it in S tier because I don't think it's as powerful as the myth of human nature, but it's definitely close. The myth of freedom is a high A tier. I'd like to share some context for the next one. I grew up in what was called a full gospel church that, despite being based in Trinidad and Tobago, was very tapped into the American evangelical movement. One of the most common refrains I heard in that setting was that we're living in the end times, and Jesus is coming soon. I'm no longer a believer, but when I was, especially as a child, the myth of end times was an ever-present terror in my imagination. This is the belief that society is inevitably hurtling toward a singular, catastrophic conclusion. I've encountered it mostly in the context of the divine, which is perhaps the most resilient form of this belief, but there are those who reach similar conclusions through environmental collapse, nuclear war, or technological dystopia. Wrap it up, go out in a blaze of hedonistic glory, or say your prayers, because everything will culminate into a decisive end. This myth creates fear, paralysis, cynicism, and, oddly, the false comfort of closure. Those of the evangelical persuasion will say all of this was prophesied long ago, so there's nothing we can or should do about it. The thing is, though Judgment Day may not be real, climate change is. We may not be able to avoid all of its consequences, but this idea will have you completely resigned to our fate. These crises are not preordained and monolithic. They're ongoing and uneven processes that are and will continue to be shaped by our choices and systems. It is not too late to shape a different fate. This myth goes in the C tier. Some of its manifestations are quite niche and difficult to uproot, but I think despite our current trajectories, enough of us can recognize that the future is not yet written. The myth of separation is the belief that different aspects of society, life, and the natural world exist as independent entities that can be understood, managed, and reformed in isolation from the larger system they're a part of. So you have people who believe that we just need to make some tweaks to democracy, or introduce some regulation to the mining industry, or fight for a shorter workday, or ban plastic bags. But this system is so much bigger than that. Every sphere of human life is tied in some way to every other aspect within this system. Entertainment is tied to politics, housing is tied to economics, work is tied to medicine, transport is tied to energy. It's all integrated into the whole, and these individual aspects can't be understood or dealt with meaningfully on their own. But the system wants us to specialize our fight within one sphere or another. It wants us to focus on patriarchy and ignore capitalism. It wants us to fight capitalism and forget the state. It wants us fixated on white supremacy while patriarchy festers. Don't even think about the common thread of authority. Even better, you should niche down even further. Forget capitalism, we just have to fight the healthcare crisis. Forget the state is really this one political party that's the problem. Forget patriarchy, we just don't have enough female CEOs. The great tragedy is that by buying into this myth, your attempts to solve one issue will simply worsen another. Your attempts to fight overfishing will cause entire villages to lose their livelihoods, and your attempts to create new jobs by expanding the logging sector will decimate ecosystems. The myth of separation belongs in the B tier. It's true that many people are still overly focused on one pet issue or another to the detriment of everything else, but there are people who see the connections. We just need to make more of them to paint a clearer picture of the whole. By thinking holistically, our resistance is bound to be far more meaningful and effective. Next, the myth of authority is so potent and persistent that, with a very few notably anarchist or anarchic exceptions, even the most imaginative and passionate revolutionaries find it difficult or even impossible to challenge. It's so pervasive that there are even self-proclaimed anarchists who struggle to fully unroot it from their minds. The myth of authority is the belief that authority, as in the recognized right above others to give commands, make decisions, enforce obedience, control property, use violence, etc., is necessary and inevitable. That without authority, society would collapse. Authority manifests implicitly and explicitly throughout the system, through governments and their institutions, capitalist firms, and hierarchies on the basis of race, gender, sexuality, and so on, where those at the top have the right to commit actions or control resources that those at the bottom do not. You don't have a right to punch a police officer, even in self-defense, because they have a right to shoot or jail you. You don't have a right to live in an empty home, because the landlords, the banks, and the state have the right to evict you. You don't have the right to travel as you please, because governments have the right to cut up the earth and box you into their borders. You and your co-workers are exploited at work because the owner has the right to direct and profit from your collective force. The things you produce as a whole that no one produced alone. The desires of authorities overrule your own. In order to obscure its harmful consequences, authority is often conflated with more neutral concepts. Opposition to authority is taken to mean opposition to expertise, influence, respect, coordination, or all uses of force and violence. But none of these concepts on their own grant any rights above others. That is the domain of authority. The myth of authority results in the division of society into rulers who exploit and dominate the ruled. Those in subordinate positions are thus stripped of their ability to self-organize and realize their full potential, while those in superior positions become isolated and detached from the perspectives and needs of those below them. Conflict abounds, as authorities compete for control, subordinates compete for scraps, and authorities and subordinates clash over their opposing interests. While violence is occasionally used to quell uprisings against certain manifestations of authority, what truly maintains that authority is social conditioning and sheer inertia. So if these rights are what elevate the rulers over the ruled, what happens if we reject the rights of authority entirely? In that case, there would be no permission and no prohibition. Nobody's desires would overrule anyone else's. There would be anarchy. And yet, we'd still be mutually interdependent. So through free association, the ability to associate and disassociate with others as you please, you'd find yourself in groups of those you share an affinity or desire with. You'd be part of a group of people who really appreciate powerlifting, or repairing bikes, or growing grains. And those groups would have to interact with other groups who forge weightlifting equipment, supply the metals needed to make parts, or make breads at a local kitchen. Nobody would have a right to the fruit of everybody's collective force, so folks can just share that fruit freely, perhaps through the commons. And what about the violent chaos that authorities claim they're necessary to resist? Well, nobody wants to be put in harm's way, negatively affected by the actions of another, or have the networks that sustain their lives disrupted. So people will naturally step in and resolve the conflicts that arise, or better yet, preempt the rise of conflicts by first consulting those who might be affected by their actions. You don't need an authority to tell you to defend yourself, to defend the weak, or to make sure your actions don't have consequences that will end up biting you in the butt down the line. You just need sense and practice with living anarchically. But I digress. If you want to learn more, I have just the video for you. The myth of authority is going in the S tier. It is tied to, and just as, if not more potent than the myth of universal human nature. The internalization of this myth on a massive scale is what keeps the whole system going. But we can't build a world without rulers and ruled. And it starts by letting go of this next myth. The myth of the only way refers to the belief that this system must continue at any cost and must not be abandoned under any circumstance. It's the idea that capitalism, the state, and authority in general are the only viable ways for humanity to organize itself. That however flawed they may be, they're inevitable, eternal, and necessary for order, prosperity, and survival, and any attempt to dismantle these systems and try something new will lead to turmoil, regression, and suffering. But none of this is natural or inevitable. A system born from a legacy of conquest, colonization, and the consolidation of power is not the only way. Humans are capable of several possibilities. We can do better. The myth of the only way is going in the A tier. It's the dominant narrative in a time of great unrest. We just need more people to realize that this isn't the only way and organize accordingly for things to change. That's all the myths I'm going to rank today. I have many more myths that I could potentially cover, as well as the potential to expand on any of these, but for now, stick around if you're interested in where we go from there. People have these beliefs as a result of their conditions, and they won't seek to change these conditions without challenging those beliefs. We can't just change our personal MO and leave the system intact, but we also can't meaningfully change the world if we're still trapped in aspects of status quo thinking. So...
Both is good.
we have to both change the world, as in the conditions we're in, and change our minds, as in the beliefs we hold. To do so, we need to understand the role of powers, drives, and consciousness in affecting change, as explored brilliantly in Prefigurative Politics, Building Tomorrow Today, by Paul Reichstadt and Sofa Schaugredin. Powers refers to our abilities to act and our capacities to experience. You might have the power to grow food, appreciate music, or mediate conflicts. Of course, which powers and how powers develop will depend on your specific social, historical, and natural conditions. Someone who grows up in a bureaucratic hellscape might get quite good at filing reports, while someone living in an anarchist society would be well practiced in conflict resolution. Growing corn might look different depending on whether you're from ancient Mesoamerica or any town USA. By creating the conditions where people can freely participate in society, we expand people's powers to organize in such a society. Drives refers to the motivations and desires that propel our activity, shaped by culture and history. Hunger may be universal, for example, but some of us prefer doubles for breakfast and others prefer dessert. Drives shape and are shaped by powers. The more you learn, the better you learn, and the more you want to learn. The more you dance, the better you dance, and the more you want to dance. The more we reclaim our autonomy from the system, the better we get at practicing that autonomy, and the more we want to expand that autonomy. Consciousness is the capacity for reflection and deliberate action. It's what enables us to evaluate and adapt to our situation, but also imagine and strategize to create new ways of living. If our consciousness is limited or misleading, that could hamper our capacity for change. We might spend time, energy, and resources pursuing means that will never achieve our desired ends. So we need to expand our consciousness through both theoretical development and practical experiment. Powers, drives, and consciousness interact to shape behavior and society. So it's important to understand what role they play if you want to create change. Practically speaking, that change making will fall into one or both of two camps: the things we do to oppose the current system and the things we do to propose alternatives. I expand on this much further in some of my previous videos, but we have to confront authorities directly in protest, strike against or boycott them in ways that make a difference, create and spread media and memes that affect the popular consciousness, and build and live out the liberatory systems and relationships we desire. Through all of these actions, we can manifest a true social revolution. In the beginning, I said that memes run the world. It's time to create new ones and shape the world accordingly. All power to all the people. Peace. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share with your fellow peoples. Thanks to the seedlings, the saplings, and especially the roots for making all of this possible, including our newest members, Patrick Thelwell, Pickles, and Vachausen. You can join these beautiful humans and support me too on patreon.com/SaneTrue. Check out my other videos for a range of radical topics. Thanks again. Peace.